The late August heat bore down on the Wyoming territory like a brand pressed against bare skin, unforgiving and absolute. Josephine Hart stood in the doorway of her homestead cabin, watching dust devils spiral across the parched grassland, and felt the weight of 6 lives pressing against her shoulders like stones in a sack. Inside, her sons moved through their chores with the quiet efficiency she'd drilled into them since Daniel died. Samuel at 14, already walking with his father's stride. Jacob at 12, sharp-eyed and cautious. Moses at 10, still young enough to hum, worked Benjamin at 8, gangly and eager. And the little ones Thomas and Daniel Jr., 2 and 1, who knew their father only as a name and a grave marker on the hill. She'd been a widow for 8 months. The official story was that Daniel Hart had been thrown from his horse during a storm, his neck broken on the rocks near Crow Creek. She'd believed it at first, had wept over his body in the undertaker's parlor, while Sheriff Joseph McCready stood in the corner with his glass eye catching the lamplight like a marble had buried him in the small cemetery outside town, while the preacher spoke empty words about God's mysterious ways. But belief was a luxury she could no longer afford. The ledger sat on the kitchen table, now wrapped in oilcloth, its leather cover cracked and stained with what might have been blood. She'd found it 3 days ago, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in Daniel's workshop, a place she'd avoided for months, because the smell of sawdust and linseed oil made her throat close up with grief. She'd been looking for his good hammer, the one with a hickory handle he'd carved himself, thinking Samuel could use it. Instead, her fingers had brushed against something that didn't belong. And when she'd pried up the board, there it was. She'd sat on the workshop floor for 2 hours reading it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. Names, dates, amounts of money, a meticulous record of children, dozens of them taken from the westbound trains on the Union Pacific Line near Cheyenne, and placed with families who paid handsomely for the privilege. Except these weren't placements, they were sales. And the children weren't going to families at all. Some went to mines in Montana, marked with a simple M and a number. Others to establishments in Denver and Cheyenne that Daniel had marked with a red X and the word no underlined 3 times. A few simply disappeared their final destinations, marked only with abbreviations she didn't understand and didn't want to. The entries went back 5 years, and 3 names appeared again and again at the bottom of each transaction, written in different hands. Judge Owen Rigsby, Sheriff Joseph McCready, and Bill Calder, the largest rancher in the territory here. But there was a 4th name, too, one that appeared less frequently, but always alongside the largest payments. The handwriting was elegant, educated, unlike the others. She couldn't quite make it out. The ink had smudged in places, but it looked like N. Holmes, or perhaps N. Holmes. Whoever it was had received payments totaling thousands of dollars. Daniel's handwriting appeared in the margins, notes, questions, a crude map of Calder's ranch with certain buildings circled. And on the last page, dated 2 days before his death, a single sentence in his careful script, "They know I know. Taking this to Marshall Holmes in Cheyenne. If something happens to me, Josie run." Marshall Holmes, the same initials as the 4th conspirator. But that couldn't be right, could it? She pushed the thought away. It didn't matter now. What mattered was survival. She hadn't run, not immediately. First, she'd sat with the knowledge like a woman, holding hot coals, letting it burn through denial and disbelief until only rage remained. Then she'd spent 2 days planning, gathering supplies, making sure the boys were ready without telling them why. She'd sewn the ledger into the lining of her traveling coat, loaded her father's old Colt revolver, the one he'd carried through the Mexican War, and told Samuel they were going on a trip to visit her cousin in Laram. She'd been lying to her children a lot lately. It was just one more sin to add to the ledger of her soul. The sound of hoofbeat-tats pulled her from her thoughts. 4 riders coming fast from the direction of town, dust plume rising behind them like smoke from a signal fire. Her stomach clenched. She stepped back inside, closed the door, and called quietly to Samuel. "Get your brothers to the root cellar now. Don't argue." Samuel's face went pale, but he moved immediately, gathering the younger ones with swift, silent efficiency. Moses opened his mouth to protest, but Jacob clapped a hand over it and hauled him toward the trap door. Within 2 minutes, all 6 boys were below ground, but the door covered with a kitchen rug and a chair, positioned just so. Josephine stood in the center of the room, the Colt heavy in her skirt pocket, and waited. The riders didn't bother to knock. The door crashed open, and Prairie Hawk filled the frame 6 feet of muscle and meanness. His face weathered like old leather, his eyes the color of dirty ice. He was Calder's foreman, and the man who did the rancher's wet work, and everyone in the territory knew it. Behind him stood 3 more of Calder's men hands, resting on their gun belts. Mrs. Hart. Prairie Hawk's voice was like gravel sliding down a chute. "We've come about something that belongs to Mr. Calder. I have nothing that belongs to Bill Calder." She kept her voice steady, her hand near her pocket. "Now that's not entirely true, is it?" He stepped inside his boots, leaving mud prints on her clean floor. "Your husband took something before he died. Something important. We'd like it back. My husband died in an accident. Sheriff McCready told me so himself." Prairie Hawk smiled, and it was the ugliest thing she'd ever seen. "Sheriff McCready tells a lot of people a lot of things. Doesn't make them true. The ledger, Mrs. Hart. I won't ask nice again." She could feel her heartbeat in her temples and her wrists in her throat. "I don't know what you're talking about." He moved fast for a big man, crossing the room in 3 strides and grabbing her arm hard enough to bruise. "Your husband was a fool who stuck his nose where it didn't belong. Don't be a fool like him. Give us the book, and maybe your boys get to grow up without a mother." The threat was clear, and it cut through her fear like a knife through silk. She thought of Daniel's knot, and knew with sudden crystalline clarity that there would be no reasoning with these men. No appeal to mercy or law. They'd killed her husband. They'd kill her and her children just as easily. She drove her knee into Prairie Hawk's groin with all her strength. He doubled over with a grunt, and she was moving before he hit the floor, yanking the Colt from her pocket and firing. The shot went wide. She hadn't fired a gun in years, but it bought her seconds. She bolted for the back door, heard shouting behind her, another gunshot that splintered the door frame near her head and sent splinters flying into her hair. She ran. The horse she'd saddled that morning was tied behind the house, her emergency supplies already packed in the saddlebags. She'd hoped she wouldn't need them. She'd been catastrophically wrong. She swung into the saddle and kicked the mare into a gallop, heading north toward the broken country where the grassland gave way to ravines and rock formations, and the Lakota hunting grounds that white men avoided like plague. More gunshots. A bullet winded past her ear. She bent low over the horse's neck and rode like the devil himself was chasing her, because in a sense he was behind her. She could hear them mounting up, hear Prairie Hawk bellowing orders through what must have been considerable pain. They'd follow. They'd catch her eventually. 4 men on fresh horses against 1 woman on a mare already winded from the morning's work. But she wasn't running to escape. She was running to buy time to get far enough from the homestead that when she circled back for her boys under cover of darkness, Calder's men would still be searching the Badlands for her. It was a desperate plan. It was the only plan she had. The sun was a brass coin in a bleached sky when her horse began to falter. She'd pushed the mare too hard, and now the animal's flanks were lathered with foam, its breathing labored and harsh. Josephine slowed to a walk, her own lungs burning, and looked back. No dust plume, no riders. Either she'd lost them in the maze of gullies and rock spires, or they were tracking her quietly, which was somehow worse. She was maybe 10 miles north of her homestead, deep in territory she'd never traveled. The land here was older, harder, carved by wind and ancient waters into fantastic shapes. Towers of red sandstone that looked like melting candles, slot canyons barely wide enough for a horse cliffs that rose like cathedral walls. Beautiful and deadly. A woman could die of thirst here in sight of her own homestead, could fall into a crevice and never be found. The horse stumbled, and Josephine dismounted her legs, trembling with exhaustion and fear. She led the mare into the shadow of a rock overhang and gave her water from her canteen, rationing it carefully. Then she climbed to higher ground, using handholds in the sandstone, and scanned the southern horizon, with one hand shading her eyes. There, 4 riders, maybe a mile back, moving methodically through the ravines hunting. Her hands shook as she descended. She had maybe an hour before they found her, maybe less. The mare couldn't run anymore. She couldn't fight 4 armed men. She couldn't. The sound froze her in place. A footstep, the soft scrape of leather on stone. She spun, hand on her colt, and found herself staring at a man who seemed to have materialized from the rocks themselves. He was Lakota. She recognized the style of his boogans, the way his hair was braided with what looked like eagle feathers, and he stood with the absolute stillness of someone who'd spent his life hunting. A scar ran down his left forearm, old and white against his brown skin, shaped like a lightning bolt. His eyes were dark and unreadable, but not hostile. Not yet. "You run from men with guns," he said in English, his accent slight but unmistakable. It wasn't a question. Josephine's throat was desert dry. "Yes. Why do they hunt you?" She could lie. Should lie. This was a Lakota warrior, and relations between his people and white settlers ranged from uneasy to openly hostile, especially after what had happened at Little Bighorn 2 summers ago. But something in his face, a careful intelligence, a willingness to listen rather than simply react, made her tell the truth. "I have proof that powerful men in my town are stealing children and selling them. My husband tried to stop them. They killed him. Now they want to kill me." The warrior was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Your town is Sweetwater Springs." "Yes. How did you?" "A child was taken from my brother's lodge 2 summers ago. A girl, 6 winters old. Men with papers came to the reservation and said she was needed at a school in the east. Her name was Lily Running Deer." His voice remained flat, but something flickered in his eyes, a pain so deep it had no bottom. "She never arrived at any school. The agent said she must have run away, but my brother's daughter would not run. She was a good child, obedient." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. She reached into her coat with shaking hands, felt the outline of the ledger through the lining. "What was the date? When was she taken?" "The month you called July. 2 years passed, the 12th day." She tore the stitches holding the ledger in place, her fingers clumsy with urgency. When she finally freed it and flipped through the pages, she found the entry written in Rigby's cramped hand. "July 12th, 1876. Female Lakota, age 6. Lily R. delivered to Calder Ranch. Payment received $200. Buyer NH specialty request." The last part made her stomach turn. She turned the ledger toward him. "Is this her?" The warrior stepped closer, his movements careful, controlled. He looked at the page, and for the first time his expression changed. Grief, rage, both wearing behind his eyes like storm clouds gathering. "Lily Running Deer," he said quietly. "My brother's daughter, my niece." He looked up at Josephine, and she saw something fierce and terrible in his gaze. "You have seen her?" "No, but this ledger lists every child they've taken, where they went, how much they were paid." If we can get it to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne, we can stop them. We can find Lily. You believe the white man's law will help?" His skepticism was sharp as broken glass. "I have to believe something." She met his gaze without flinching. "Those men will catch me soon. They'll kill me and take this book, and everyone in it will stay lost forever. But if you help me get back to my homestead, my children are hidden there. If you help us reach Cheyenne, I swear on my husband's grave, I'll do everything in my power to find your niece." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sense that he was reading her soul, weighing her worth against some internal measure she couldn't begin to understand. Finally, he said, "I am Knipe. I will help you, but not because I trust white law. Because Lily's spirit cries out in my dreams, and I have heard it for 2 years, with no way to answer." Relief made her knees weak. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet. The men who hunt you, how many?" "4. Armed, experienced. The leader is called Prairie Hawk. He's Bill Calder's foreman." Knipe's expression darkened. "I know this man. He has killed Lakota for sport. He is clever and has no honor. Then we're in trouble." "Yes, but trouble is not the same as defeat." He gestured toward her exhausted horse. "Leave her. She's finished. She is. We go on foot through the old paths. They will not follow where we go." He was right. Within an hour he'd led her through passages so narrow she had to turn sideways, her dress catching on rocks across a rock. Faces, where one misstep meant a 50-foot fall onto jagged boulders into a slot canyon whose entrance was hidden behind a curtain of juniper so thick it seemed impossible to penetrate. The August heat was murderous, trapped between the stone walls like heat in an oven, and her dress was soaked with sweat clinging to her skin, but she didn't complain. Behind them, she could hear the distant shouts of Calder's men growing fainter with each turn. By dusk, they'd reached a place where the canyon opened into a hidden valley green with cottonwoods and watered by a thin stream that bubbled up from some underground source. A dozen lodges stood in a loose circle, smoke rising from their peaks into the evening air. People emerged as Enipe appeared, women with children on their hips, old men with faces like carved wood, young warriors with rifles and bows. They stared at Josephine with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. An older man approached his hair silver, as moonlight a necklace of bear claws at his throat. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, and Anapi answered in the same language, gesturing to Josephine. The conversation went on for several minutes, voices rising occasionally in what sounded like argument, until finally the older man nodded curtly and walked away, his posture radiating disapproval. "That was Chief Satan Luda Redhawk," Enipai said. "He will allow you to stay tonight. Tomorrow we will go to your homestead for your children." "Thank you," Josephine said again, and this time he didn't tell her not to. A woman approached then, younger than Josephine by perhaps 5 years, with a face that might have been beautiful once, but now held a kind of deep, quiet sadness that went bone deep. She spoke softly to Anipe, then looked at Josephine with dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "This is Tala." Anipe said she lost her own child to sickness last winter. "She will give you food and a place to sleep." Tala led Josephine to a lodge at the edge of the circle and gestured for her to sit on a buffalo hide. She brought water in a clay bowl, dried meat that was surprisingly tender, and something that might have been corn cakes sweetened with honey. Josephine ate mechanically, her mind still racing. Her boys were alone, hidden in the root cellar. How long could they stay there? What if Calder's men came back, searched the house more thoroughly? What if Samuel panicked and ran with his brothers into the night? Tala said something in Lakota, her voice gentle. When Josephine looked up confused, the woman mimed rocking a baby, then pointed to Josephine and held up fingers. 6. "Yes," Josephine said. 6 sons. Tala's face softened with understanding, and she touched her own chest, then held up one finger and looked down, her meaning clear. One child gone. They sat together in silence. After that, two mothers bound by loss and grief. And somehow it was more comforting than any words could have been. That night, Josephine lay on a buffalo hide in Tala's lodge and stared at the smoke hole above, watching stars appear one by one, like holes punched in black velvet. She thought about Daniel, about the ledger, about the impossible thing she was trying to do. She thought about Face when he'd seen Lily's name, that moment of raw anguish before the mask came back down. She thought about her boys in the darkness beneath their home, waiting for her with a faith that only children possess. She didn't sleep, but somewhere near dawn, exhaustion pulled her under like a drowning woman sinking beneath dark water, and she dreamed of nothing at all. They left before sunrise when the world was still gray and uncertain. Knipe had two horses his own, and one borrowed from a young warrior who looked like he'd rather lend his sister. Josephine rode behind Anipe, holding onto his waist as they picked their way through the pre-dawn darkness, following paths only he could see. His body was solid beneath her grip, radiating warmth in the cold morning air. And she found herself noticing details she shouldn't. And the breath of his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he sat the horse, like he'd been born to it. "Your husband," Anipe said after an hour of silence. "He was a good man." The question surprised her. Yes, he was kind, fair. He saw wrong being done, and he couldn't turn away from it. That's what killed him. Then he died with honor. Honor doesn't keep your children fed. No. Anipe agreed. It does not. But it is still worth something. A man without honor is just meat that walks. Your husband chose to be more than meat. The way he said it, simple, absolute, made something in her chest tighten. They reached the homestead an hour after dawn, approaching from the north through a wash that provided cover. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs as they drew closer. The house looked untouched from a distance. No smoke, no signs of occupation. But as they crept closer on foot, she could see that the front door hung open at an angle. One hinge torn loose. Inside furniture was overturned dishes, smashed her mother's quilt, the one she'd carried all the way from Missouri as a bride, ripped and trampled into the dirt. They torn the place apart, looking for the ledger, and they hadn't been gentle about it. Josephine ran to the kitchen, swept aside the rug and chair, and pulled open the trap door. Samuel, boys, its mother's silence. Her stomach dropped sickeningly. Samuel. A scraping sound. Then Samuel's face appeared in the darkness below, pale, and frightened, his eyes too large for his face. "Ma, come up quickly, all of you." They emerged like moles from a burrow. Samuel first, then Jacob dragging Moses, Benjamin, carrying Thomas despite being only 8 himself, and finally little Daniel, who started crying the moment he saw his mother. Great hiccuping sobs of relief and fear. Josephine gathered them to her, her throat tight, checking each one for injuries with trembling hands. "Are you hurt? Did anyone come?" They came back twice, Samuel said, his voice shaking but steady. "Went through everything. We stayed quiet like you said." "Ma, what's happening? Why are they?" He stopped, seeing Anipe standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light, and his hand went to the hunting knife at his belt. "It's all right," Josephine said quickly. "This is Anipe. He's helping us. We're going to Cheyenne to the marshal's office. I'll explain on the way, but we need to leave now." "Cheyenne's 3 days' ride," Samuel said, and she could hear the question beneath the statement. "We don't have a choice." She stood still, holding Daniel Jr. "Pack what you can carry. Food, blankets, water, nothing else." 5 minutes. They moved with impressive speed, even little Benjamin understanding the urgency. Anipe stood watch at the window, his rifle in his hands, scanning the horizon with the focused intensity of a hawk. When the boys were ready, 6 small bundles, 6 frightened faces, Josephine took one last look at the home she'd built with Daniel, at the life that was now ash and memory. "We go," Nipe said. "The men who hunt you will return." They traveled north again, back toward the Lakota camp, moving as fast as the younger children could manage. Moses and Benjamin took turns riding behind Nipe, while Josephine carried Daniel Jr. and Samuel carried Thomas. It was slow, brutal work under the climbing sun. By midday, Josephine's legs were trembling, her arms aching from the toddler's weight. Jacob, walking beside her, said quietly, "Ma, who's after us?" She couldn't lie anymore. These boys had a right to know why their world was ending. So, she told them not everything, not the full horror of what the ledger contained, but enough. That their father had found proof of bad men doing bad things, that he'd been killed for it, that now they were in danger too, until they could get that proof to someone who could help. Samuel's jaws set in a way that reminded her painfully of Daniel. "We should fight them." "No," she said firmly. "We survive them. That's how we win. Fighting gets you killed. Surviving gets you justice." They reached the Lakota camp by late afternoon. Chief Setan Luda emerged from his lodge as they arrived his face grave. He spoke to Anapai in Lakota, gesturing south, and even without understanding the words, Josephine could read the message in his body language. Anapai turned to her, his expression grim. "Riders were seen near here. 8 men now. Calder has brought more hunters." 8. Her voice cracked. "We can't. How do we leave tonight?" "Not for Cheyenne. The direct path is watched. We go west into the mountains, then south through the passes. It will take longer, but we will live." Chief Satan Luda spoke again, his voice harder now, and Anipi translated. "He says the white man's war has come to his camp now because of you. After tonight, you cannot return here. His people have suffered enough for helping whites." Guilt twisted in Josephine's chest like a knife. "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell him I never meant. He knows." Nipe's voice was not unkind. "He also knows that some fights choose us. We do not choose them." That night the camp prepared for their departure. Tala brought food for the journey: dried meat, pemmican parched corn, and small leather pouches of what she explained through gestures was dried fruit. She hugged Josephine once fiercely and said something in Lakota that Nipe translated as, "Protect your cubs like the mother bear. Bite and claw until they are safe." "I will," Josephine promised. They left under a moonless sky, 7 people on 3 horses moving through darkness like ghosts. Anipe let his knowledge of the land absolute. Samuel rode second, carrying Thomas. Josephine came third with Daniel Jr., while Jacob, Moses, and Benjamin walked between the horses tied together with a rope so no one would get lost in the darkness. It was the longest night of Josephine's life. Every sound made her jump a coyote's cry. Echoing across the hills, the rattle of stones under hoof, the wind through the sage making sounds like whispered warnings. She kept expecting gunfire, kept expecting Prairie Hawk to materialize from the shadows with his ugly smile and his guns. But dawn came rose and gold over the hills, and they were still alive, still moving, still free. They spent the day in a cave. Nipe knew, sleeping in shifts while one adult kept watch. The boys were exhausted, even Samuel, and they collapsed into sleep almost immediately. Josephine tried to rest, but couldn't. She sat at the cave mouth with Anipai, watching the land below for any sign of pursuit. "You are afraid," Anipai said. It wasn't a question. "Of course I'm afraid. Those men will kill all of us if they catch us. Yes, but you are more afraid for your sons than for yourself." She looked at him, then really looked. In the daylight, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray threading his black hair. He was perhaps her own age, maybe slightly younger. The scar on his forearm was old, faded to silver. His hands were steady on his rifle, but she noticed they were scarred too, at the hands of a man who'd worked and fought and survived. "You have no children of your own?" she asked. "I did. A wife and a son. They died in the winter. 3 years passed. Sickness that came from the reservation, the white man's measles. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your husband. Death is death. Grief is grief. The Lakota and the whites are not so different in this." They sat in silence for a while. Then Josephine said, "Why are you helping us, really? Is it just for Lily?" Anipe considered the question, his dark eyes fixed on the horizon. "Lily is part of it. But I also think when I saw you in the rocks, running from men with guns, I saw something I recognized. Courage. Not the courage of a warrior who chooses battle, but the courage of someone who has no choice and fights anyway. That is a harder kind of bravery." Something warm and unexpected bloomed in Josephine's chest. She looked away suddenly, unable to meet his eyes. "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified. They are often the same thing. The bravest man I ever knew told me once that courage is not the absence of fear. It is deciding that something else is more important than fear. Your father, my son, he was 4 winters old when he said it. He did not use those words, but that is what he meant. He was afraid of the dark, but he went into it anyway to find his mother when she was sick." Knipe's voice remained steady, but she saw his jaw tighten. "He found her, but the sickness found him too." Josephine reached out without thinking and touched his hand. He didn't pull away. That afternoon, when she finally slept, she dreamed of Daniel. But for the first time since his death, the dream didn't hurt. In the dream, he was telling her to run to live, to choose the future over the past. When she woke, tears had dried on her cheeks, and Anipe was watching her with an expression of such understanding that she had to look away. They traveled for 3 more days, moving through high country, where the pines grew thick, and the air smelled of resin and distant snow, even in late summer. Knipe knew every game trail, every water source, every place where the rocks formed natural fortresses. They saw other travelers, twice a freight wagon heading east, a group of miners panning a stream, and each time they hid until the strangers passed. The boys adapted with the resilience of children. Samuel remained tense, his hand never far from the knife at his belt, but the younger ones began to treat it as an adventure. Moses taught Benjamin how to identify animal tracks in the dirt. Jacob fashioned a fishing line from thread and a bent pin and caught 3 trout in a mountain stream, his face glowing with pride. Even little Thomas stopped crying at night, sleeping soundly in his mother's arms. On the 4th evening, as they made camp in a stand of aspens, whose leaves whispered secrets in the wind, taught Josephine how to reload the Colt properly. Her father had shown her once years ago, but she'd forgotten most of it. "Your hand shakes," Anipe observed as she fumbled with the powder measure. "I know it will steady. Fear is like a wild horse. You cannot kill it, but you can learn to ride it." He placed his hand over hers, guiding the measure to the correct position. His palm was warm, calloused from years of work. Josephine felt her pulse quicken, and it had nothing to do with fear. His fingers were gentle but firm, and she found herself acutely aware of the way his thumb rested against her wrist, right where her pulse beat beneath the skin. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, a possibility, a question neither of them could ask aloud before he withdrew his hand and stepped back. "Practice," he said quietly. "You may need this skill soon." He was right. The next morning they woke to find a signal fire burning on a ridge to the south, then another answering to the east, and a third to the west. "They have found our trail," Oedipus said, his voice tight with tension. "We must move faster." "Can we outrun them?" Samuel asked. "No, but there is a place ahead, a pass through the mountains called Whirlwind Gap. The trail is narrow, defensible. If we can reach it first, we may have a chance." They rode hard for Whirlwind Gap, pushing the horses to the edge of collapse. By noon, the signal fires were closer, multiplying like evil stars across the landscape. Prairie Hawk was coordinating his men, tightening the noose with methodical precision. They had perhaps 4 hours before the trap closed completely. The pass appeared in the early afternoon, a narrow defile between two cliff faces, barely wide enough for a wagon with loose scree on both sides that looked ready to avalanche at the slightest provocation. The northern end opened onto a meadow dotted with wildflowers. The southern end twisted through rock formations before emerging onto the grassland below. "This is where we make our stand," Enipe said, dismounting. "Samuel, take your brothers through the pass to the meadow beyond. Hide in the trees at the far edge. If we fail here, you run. Do not look back. Get your brothers to Cheyenne any way you can." "No," Josephine said. "We don't split up. If they catch all of us, then they catch all of us. But I won't abandon you, and I won't send my boys into the wilderness alone." She turned to Samuel. "Take your brothers to the north end of the pass. Hide behind the largest rocks you can find. If shooting starts, you keep them down and quiet. Understand?" Samuel nodded, his face pale but determined. He was so much like his father, it made her heart ache. "Good boy." She kissed his forehead. Then each of the younger ones in turn, lingering longest on Daniel Jr., who giggled and grabbed her nose. "Be brave. Be smart. We'll come for you when it's safe." As the boys moved north through the pass, Josephine and Nipe climbed to the high points on either side of the southern entrance, finding the largest boulders, the ones perched precariously on the edge, like gods waiting to fall. "We bring down the rocks when they enter," Enipe explained, his voice low. "Block their advance, throw them into chaos. Then we pick them off from above with rifles. It is not honorable, but it may work. And if they have rifles, if they pin us down, then we use your word, we improvise." They waited, hidden among the rocks. Minutes stretched into an hour. Josephine's muscles burned from holding position, the sun beating down mercilessly on her head. Below the pass was silent, empty. She began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd lost their pursuers after all. Then she heard it. Hoof beat tats, voices calling to each other, but not from the south, from the north. Her blood turned to ice. She looked across the pass at Nipe and saw the same realization in his face. They'd been outflanked. Prairie Hawk had sent men around through another pass to cut off their escape road. "The boys," she gasped. They scrambled down from the rocks, running for the northern entrance feet, slipping on loose stone. Josephine's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. If Prairie Hawk's men found Samuel and the others, if they took them as hostages, she rounded a bend in the pass, stopped dead. 6 men on horseback the northern exit. At their head was a figure she recognized immediately. Not Prairie Hawk, but Sheriff Glassy Joe McCready himself, his prosthetic eye gleaming dully in the afternoon light star. He held Thomas in front of him on his saddle, one arm wrapped around the toddler's chest. Behind him, other riders held Samuel, Jacob, Moses, and Benjamin at gunpoint. Little Daniel was crying in the arms of a hard-faced man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. But there was another rider, too, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, his face shadowed by a broad-brimmed hat. Something about him seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. "Mrs. Hart." McCready called out, his voice oily with false politeness. I believe we have something of yours. Josephine raised her cold hands, trembling with rage and terror. Let them go. They're children. They have nothing to do with this. On the contrary, ma'am, they have everything to do with it. You're going to give me that ledger, and you're going to do it right now, or I'm going to start shooting your sons. Starting with the littlest one. He drew his revolver and pressed it against Thomas's head. Thomas whimpered, his face red and streaked with tears, his small hands clutching at McCrae's sleeve. Mama, I don't. Josephine's voice broke. Please don't hurt him. The ledger. No Wipe stood beside her, his rifle trained on McCready, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. 6 men, 6 hostages, no clear shot, no way to save them all without someone dying. If I give you the ledger, Josephine said, forcing herself to think through the panic, you'll kill us anyway. You killed Daniel. You'll kill all of us to keep your secret. McCready smiled. Not necessarily. Judge Rigsby wants the ledger destroyed. Yes, but Mr. Calder has a different idea. He's willing to let you and your boys live on one condition. What condition? You sign over your homestead to him. Every acre Daniel claimed under the Homestead Act. Good land, water rights, prime grazing. Sign it over, and you can take your brats and disappear. Go to California, Oregon, wherever. Just leave Wyoming and never come back. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This had never been just about the ledger. Calder had wanted Daniel's land all along prime grazing territory, with water rights that bordered his own ranch. The ledger had been an excuse, or perhaps an opportunity. Daniel had been murdered not just for knowing too much, but for standing in the way of Calder's expansion. You're lying, Josephine said. You'll kill us the moment I sign. Maybe, maybe not. But if you don't sign, I'll definitely kill your sons, starting right now. He cocked the hammer with a sound like a bone breaking. 1. Wait. Josephine's mind raced. She needed time, needed a distraction, needed anything. I'll sign, but the ledger's not here. I hid it. Up in the rocks. I'll show you where, but you have to let my boys go first. McCready considered this, his glass eye fixed and dead, while his real eye calculated. No, you show me where the ledger is, and then we'll talk about letting them go. Come down here slowly, and tell your Indian friend to drop his rifle, or the boy dies. Anipe glanced at her, a question in his eyes. She gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. She started walking toward McCready's hands, raised the Colt dangling from her finger by the trigger guard to show she wasn't threatening. She could see Samuel trying to catch her eye, could see the terror on his face mixed with something else. A desperate hope that she had a plan. She wished she did. She was 10 FT from McCready when the gunshot cracked out from the rocks above. One of the deputies fell from his horse, clutching his chest. Blood blooming across his shirt like a red flower. Another shot, and a second man went down. Chaos erupted. Horses rearing, men shouting, drawing weapons, looking wildly around for the shooter. Prairie Hawk's men, she realized with cold horror. They'd arrived from the south and were firing into the pass, not caring that McCyar's men were in the way. They just wanted everyone dead and the ledger retrieved. In the confusion, Samuel drove his elbow backward into his captor's stomach and dropped from the horse, hitting the ground hard but rolling to his feet. Jacob and Moses followed his lead, scattering like rabbits. Josephine raised her Colt and fired at the man holding Benjamin. Saw him jerk and fall backward. Anipe's rifle boomed. Once, twice. Men dropped like puppets with cut strings. McCready still had Thomas. He was wheeling his horse, trying to escape back through the northern exit while using the toddler as a shield. Josephine ran after him, screaming her son's name, but he was too fast, too far ahead, and she couldn't shoot without risking Thomas. Then a figure stepped out from behind a boulder at the edge of the meadow. a woman in a traveling dress and wide-brimmed hat holding a rifle with practiced ease. Dr. Lillian Pike, the town physician, the woman who'd sewn up half the settlers in Sweetwater Springs. "Let the child go, Joe," she said calmly, as if she were asking him to pass the salt at dinner. McCready froze genuine surprise, crossing his face. "Lillian, what the hell are you doing here?" "My job. I'm a Dr. Joe. I took an oath to do no harm. That includes letting you harm children." She worked the lever action with a smooth, practiced motion. "I telegraphed the U.S. Marshal 5 days ago, told him everything I suspected about you and Rigsby, and called her. Now drop the boy and surrender, or I'll put a bullet in you myself." "You wouldn't." She fired. The shot passed so close to McCready's head that his hat flew off. Thomas tumbled from the saddle, and Josephine caught him, swept him up, her whole body shaking with relief. So intense it felt like illness. Dr. Pike worked the lever again. "Next one goes through your skull." "Your choice, Joe." McCready's face went pale. He raised his hand slowly, carefully, and dismounted. But the fight wasn't over. Prairie Hawk's men were still advancing through the pass from the south, firing as they came. Josephine counted at least 5 of them, maybe more, hidden in the dust and smoke. She pulled Samuel and the younger boys toward the rocks, finding cover behind a fallen boulder, while Anape and Dr. Pike laid down covering fire. "Ma, what do we do?" Samuel shouted over the gunfire, which echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. "We survive," she said grimly. She checked the Colt 2 rounds left and looked around desperately for anything that could serve as a weapon. Her eyes fell on a stack of deadfall wood near the entrance to the meadow, dry as tinder in the late summer heat. An idea formed, desperate, probably suicidal, but maybe their only chance. "Samuel, Moses, Benjamin, gather as much dry brush and wood as you can. Pile it in the narrowest part of the pass, right there where it bottlenecks." "Quick, Ma, they're coming. Do it now, Jacob. You stay here with Thomas and Daniel. Don't move." The 3 boys moved, grabbing armfuls of dead branches, old tumbleweeds caught in rock crevices, anything combustible. Josephine ran to her saddlebag, still on one of the abandoned horses, and found the tin of Lucifer's safety matches she'd packed for the journey. Enipe saw what she was doing, and understanding flashed across his face like lightning. He redoubled his fire, targeting the lead riders, forcing them to slow their advance and take cover. The boys piled the last of the brush across the pass just as Prairie Hawk and his men came into view around the bend, riding hard. Josephine struck a match, her hand steady now, and touched it to the tinder. The fire caught instantly, leaping up with a hungry roar, fueled by weeks of drought. Smoke billowed into the narrow defile, thick and black and choking. The riders pulled up short, their horses screaming and rearing in primal terror of the flames. "Now we go!" Enipe shouted. Through the meadow into the trees they ran, Josephine carrying Thomas, Samuel carrying Daniel Jr., the others scrambling behind Dr. Pike, covering their retreat with methodical, carefully aimed shots. Behind them the fire was spreading, feeding on the dry wood and the August heat and the wind that funneled through the pass, creating a wall between them and their pursuers. They reached the treeine and kept running, plunging into a forest of lodgepole pines. The smoke followed them, but so did the sounds of pursuit men, shouting horses crashing through brush, the crack of rifles. Prairie Hawk wasn't giving up. "There's a creek ahead." Knipe gasped, his breath coming hard. "Half a mile. We reach it. We can lose them in the water." They ran until Josephine's lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Until the boys were stumbling with exhaustion, until even Samuel was gasping for air. The creek appeared a ribbon of silver through the trees, and they splashed into it, the cold water shocking after the heat. They waded downstream, letting the current help carry them, letting the water erase their tracks. They traveled in the creek for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, until even Samuel was shaking with cold and fatigue, his lips turning blue. Finally, Anipe led them out onto a rocky outcrop that wouldn't hold footprints and into a dense thicket of willows. "We wait here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Catch our breath. Listen." They waited in silence. Josephine held Thomas close, trying to stop his shivering, trying to stop her own. Dr. Pike checked each of the boys for injuries with quick, professional efficiency. Samuel had a cut on his arm from when he'd fallen from the horse. Moses had bruises on his wrists where he'd been gripped too hard. But they were alive. They were all alive. "How did you find us?" Josephine asked Dr. Pike quietly. "I've been following McCready since yesterday. When he took off with those men, I knew something was wrong. Found your trail, followed it here." She reloaded her rifle with practiced movements. "I've suspected Joe and Rigsby for years, Mrs. Hart. Your husband wasn't the first person to die conveniently, but I never had proof until Daniel started asking questions. The ledger is still safe, I hope." Josephine touched her coat. "The ledger, was there sewn into the lining pressed against her ribs?" "Yes." "Good. Because Marshal Nathaniel Holmes is supposed to be about 2 hours behind me with a full complement of deputies. We just need to stay alive until they arrive." A branch snapped somewhere in the forest. Then another. Someone was coming, moving carefully, methodically. Knipe raised his rifle. Dr. Pike did the same. Josephine positioned herself in front of the boys, the Colt in her hand, her last 2 bullets ready. Footsteps getting closer, multiple sets, a shadow moving through the trees. Then a voice, rough and familiar, the voice that had haunted her nightmares. "Mrs. Hart, I know you're here." "There's no point hiding, Prairie Hawk. Here's what's going to happen." He continued his voice, carrying through the trees like poison. "You're going to give me that ledger, or I'm going to burn this whole forest down with you in it. I've got men surrounding this area. You can't escape. So, let's make this easy. Come out now, and I promise I'll make it quick. Keep hiding, and I'll make sure your boys watch you die slow." Anipe whispered. "I can circle around, get behind him." "No," Josephine said. "He's not alone. You move, they'll hear you, and we lose our only advantage." "Then what do we do?" She looked at her son's 6 frightened faces, 6 lives, depending on her next decision. She thought about Daniel, about honor and courage, and the things worth dying for. She thought about the ledger pressed against her ribs, about the names inside it, about Lily running deer and 63 other children whose only hope was that this book survived. "We negotiate," she said. "You can't trust him." "I know, but I can buy time." She stood before Anipe could stop her and called out, "All right, Mr. Hawk, let's talk." She stepped out of the thicket, hands raised, and walked into the small clearing. Prairie Hawk emerged from behind a pine, his gun drawn, his face bloodied from the rock slide at the pass, but his eyes still full of that terrible, calculating meanness. Behind him, she could see at least 3 other men positioned in the trees. "Smart choice," he said. "The ledger. Hand it over. First, tell me something. Why do you do it? The children. How can you live with yourself? How can I?" He laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Lady, I do what I'm paid to do. Calder says, round up some orphans. I round up some orphans. Rigsby says, dispose of a problem. I dispose of it. It's just business, nothing personal. It's children, human beings. It's survival. You think any of us have the luxury of being saints out here? This territory eats saints for breakfast and spits out the bones." He gestured with his gun. "Now stop stalling. The book last chance." Josephine reached into her coat fingers, touching the ledger through the fabric. This was it. The moment when either she found a way out or everything ended. That's when she saw it. Behind Prairie Hawk, maybe 100 yards back through the trees, the glint of metal. Then another men moving through the forest, surrounding the area. But these men were different. Then they moved with military precision, and she could see badges catching the light. The marshal had arrived. She just needed to keep Prairie Hawk talking for 30 more seconds. "You're wrong," she said, her voice stronger now, "about survival, about what it takes to live out here. My husband was proof of that. He chose to do the right thing, even though it cost him everything. That's not weakness. That's the only kind of strength that matters. Your husband was a fool, and he died like one. Begged for his life at the end. Did you know that? Cried like a baby." Prairie Hawk's smile was vicious. "Didn't do him any good. Won't do you any good either. Now give me the damn. Drop your weapons, U.S. Marshal. You're surrounded." Prairie Hawk spun, firing wildly in the direction of the voice. Return fire erupted from a dozen positions, at once deafening in the confined space of the forest. Josephine threw herself flat, covering her head, feeling bullets whine overhead. When she looked up seconds later, Prairie Hawk was on the ground, his chest a red ruin, his eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy above. His men were down too, one dead, two wounded, and disarmed one with his hands raised in surrender. Marshal Nathaniel Holmes emerged from the trees, his badge gleaming on his vest, his rifle smoking. He was a tall man, perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and eyes like chips of blue ice. "Mrs. Hart," his voice was concerned. "Are you injured?" "No, my boys. They're in the thicket. We've got them. They're safe. Dr. Pike is with them." Josephine's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the forest floor among the pine needles and started to laugh high and slightly hysterical because they were alive, and they were actually alive. And it was over. It was finally over. Except it wasn't. Marshal Holmes approached, and as he got closer, something about his face made her stomach clench. Something familiar. She pulled the ledger from her coat with shaking hands and opened it to the last page, to that fourth name she'd never quite been able to read. And Holmes. Not an Holmes, as she'd thought. Not some unknown conspirator. And Holmes, Nathaniel Holmes, the U.S. Marshal. She looked up at him and saw in his eyes that he knew she knew. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and raised his rifle. The shot came from behind him. Dr. Pike stepped out of the trees, her rifle still smoking her face, set in lines of grim determination. Holmes fell forward, a hole in his back the size of a fist, dead before he hit the ground. "I suspected," Dr. Pike said, her voice shaking but steady. "For years, I suspected the way cases disappeared, the way evidence vanished, the way Daniel died right before he was supposed to meet with Holmes." She lowered her rifle, staring at the body. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hart. I should have warned you sooner, but I couldn't be sure until I saw his face just now. The way he looked at you, the way his hand moved toward his gun." Josephine stared at the body of the man who was supposed to save them. He was the one who bought Lily, the specialty request. "Yes, I think so. The payments in the ledger, they're larger for him than anyone else. He wasn't just protecting the conspiracy. He was part of it, maybe even running it." The other federal deputies were emerging from the trees, now confused, shouting questions. Dr. Pike raised her voice. Marshal Holmes was about to murder Mrs. Hart, or witnessed it. He's part of the conspiracy she's been fleeing. The deputies looked at each other uncertainly. The ledger lay on the ground where Josephine had dropped it. She picked it up with trembling hands and held it out. "It's all in here," she said. "Names, dates, payments, everything, including payments to end Holmes. Your marshal, he's been selling children for years." The senior deputy, A grizzled man with a well-worn federal badge took the ledger and began reading. His face went white, then red with rage. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed. "Sweet, merciful Jesus, Holmes." How could he look at Josephine? "Ma'am, I swear to you, the rest of us knew nothing about this. Nothing." "I believe you," she said, because what else could she do? The next hours passed in a blur of statements and questions, and the grim business of dealing with bodies. McCready was taken into custody, bound hand and foot, and gagged when he wouldn't stop cursing. The surviving members of Calder's gang were rounded up. The ledger was placed in a leather satchel and locked in a strong box under guard. They made camp that night in the meadow with deputies, standing watch and rotating shifts. The boys finally slept exhausted beyond fear. Josephine sat by the fire with both of them too drained to speak. Finally, she said, "You saved our lives multiple times. You saved mine first with the rocks, with the fire, with your courage. Lily will still find her. Even without Holmes, the ledger has everything. Where she was taken, when, by whom. I know." He stared into the flames. "And when we find her, what? Then I take her back to the reservation." "You go where?" "I don't know. Somewhere far from Wyoming, somewhere my boys can grow up without looking over their shoulders. You could come with us to the reservation. There are some white families nearby. You could iron." She turned to face him. "We both know that's not possible. Your people barely tolerate whites as it is. After everything that's happened, the wars, the broken treaties, the children stolen, if you brought home a white woman and her 6 sons, what do you think would happen? I would protect you. You shouldn't have to. And my boys shouldn't grow up where they're not wanted, where every day is a fight just to be accepted." Her voice broke. "I wish things were different. I wish we lived in a world where it didn't matter. But we don't." He was silent for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, wrapped in soft leather. "I want you to have this." She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a beautifully carved wooden bird, small enough to fit in her palm, every feather detailed with extraordinary care. "What is it?" she whispered. "A hawk, Wang Blee. Lily's namesake. It means she who runs with the birds. I carved it while we traveled in the evenings while you slept." He closed her fingers around it. "I want you to have it so you will remember us. Remember this time when 2 people from different worlds fought side by side and survived. I could never forget you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Never. And I could never forget you, Josephine Hart." His voice was rough. "You are the bravest person I have ever known. When I saw you step out of the thicket to face Prairie Hawk, knowing you might die doing it anyway to buy time for your sons in that moment, I thought my heart would stop beating." She reached up and touched his face, memorizing the feel of his skin beneath her fingers, the rough stubble on his jaw, the warmth of him. "Anipe, do not say it." His hand covered hers. "If you say it, leaving will be impossible, and we both know we must leave each other." So she didn't say it. Instead, she kissed him. It was brief, desperate, and utterly devastating. A kiss that held everything they couldn't say, everything they couldn't have, everything they wished for in a different world. When she pulled back, his eyes were wet. "Goodbye, Anipe. Goodbye, Josephine Hart. May the spirits watch over you and your sons." She walked back to where her boys slept, the carved hawk clutched in her hand, and she didn't look back because if she looked back, she would never be able to leave. The trials were held in Cheyenne over the course of 4 months. It became known as the Home Scandal and rocked the territorial government to its foundations. The ledger was entered as evidence, and Josephine's testimony was clear and unwavering, despite 3 separate attempts on her life that were thwarted by federal protection. Judge Rigsby was convicted of conspiracy, trafficking, and murder. He received a 30-year sentence in federal prison. Sheriff McCready received 25 years. Bill Calder had died of his heart attack, but his estate was liquidated, every penny going to a victim compensation fund. But the real work was finding the children. Federal agents raided mines, brothel, work camps, and private homes across 4 territories. 63 children were recovered alive. 11 were confirmed dead. 27 were still missing, their trails gone cold in the vast western territories. Lily Running Deer was found in late October in a private home in Montana, kept as a servant by a wealthy family who'd paid Marshall Holmes $300 for a docile Indian girl. She was thin, quiet, and initially didn't respond to Lakota. But when Anape walked into that house and spoke her name, something woke in her eyes, and she ran to him with a cry that broke the hearts of everyone present. Josephine was there when it happened. She'd traveled to Montana specifically to witness the reunion, had testified in the proceedings that returned Lily to her family. And when she saw the little girl in Anape's arms, both of them weeping, she knew that everything, the fear, the flight, the fires of Whirlwind Gap, the deaths, had been worth it. Afterward, in the hallway of the county courthouse, Anape took Josephine's hand. "Come with us," he said. "Please, we will find a way." She wanted to say yes. God, how she wanted to say yes. But she looked through the window at her 6 boys waiting in the wagon, at Samuel, holding baby Daniel, at the way they watched her with absolute trust and faith. And she knew what she had to do. "I can't," she whispered. "My boys need stability. They need a place where they belong. And you and Lily need to heal without the complication of a white woman and her children. You need to go home and pay. And so do I. Where is home for you now?" "I don't know yet, but I'll find it." He nodded slowly, understanding even as it broke something in both of them. Then he touched her face one last time, his fingers gentle. "You are in my heart, Josephine Hart. You will always be in my heart, and you in mine." She walked away down the courthouse steps, across the yard to her waiting sons. She climbed into the wagon and picked up the res, and she drove away without looking back. Behind her, through the courthouse window, Nipe stood watching until she was out of sight. 1 year later, Josephine stood on the porch of her house in Denver, a modest 2-story with a garden and room enough for 6 growing boys, and opened the letter that had arrived that morning. The envelope was worn from travel, addressed in careful, laborious English. "Mrs. Josephine Hart, I write to you from the reservation. It has been 1 year since we parted in Montana, and I wanted you to know that all is well. Lily grows stronger each day. She speaks our language fluently now, and she laughs often, a sound her father says he thought he would never hear again. She asks about you sometimes, about the white woman with 6 sons who helped bring her home. I tell her you were brave beyond measure and kind, and that the world needs more people like you. The winter was hard, as winters always are on the reservation, but we survived it together. The government has begun sending more supplies, and there is talk of better schools, better treatment for our people. I do not know if these promises will be kept, but at least they are being made. Some of that is because of you, because of the storm you began when you found that ledger and refused to stay silent. 63 children came home because of you. 63 families reunited. That is a legacy worth more than gold. I think of you often. I think of your courage and your sons, the days we spent running from death toward life. I think of Whirlwind Gap and the fire you set, and the way you stepped out of hiding to face Prairie Hawk, even though you knew you might die. That kind of bravery is rare. Cherish it. I still have your image carved in my memory, your hand in mine by the fire, your voice saying my name, your kiss that I carry with me like a talisman. These memories keep me warm in the cold months. They remind me that even in the darkest times, there can be moments of light and grace. I do not know if our paths will cross again in this life, but I am grateful that they crossed at all. Be well, Josephine Hart. Be safe. Be happy. Raise your sons to be good men and tell them that once a long time ago, a Lakota warrior fought beside their mother and counted it the greatest honor of his life. I think of you under the stars, and I hope you sometimes think of me. Yours in memory and respect. Nipe. Josephine read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears. Then she carefully folded it and placed it in her wooden box beside Daniel's photograph and the carved hawk and the handful of other things she considered precious beyond measure. Samuel came out onto the porch. At 15, he was already taller than she was, with his father's steady gaze and something of Anape's quiet strength in the set of his shoulders. "Ma, you all right?" "Yes." She wiped her eyes, just remembering what people I've loved, choices I've made, how strange and unpredictable life can be. Samuel sat down beside her on the porch swing. "Do you ever regretted everything that happened?" She thought about Daniel murdered for doing the right thing, about the terror of being hunted, about Whirlwind Gap and the fire and the moment when she thought she'd lost her sons forever, about's hand in hers, and the goodbye that had broken something in her chest that still hadn't fully healed. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. It was hard and painful, and I lost things I could never get back. But we survived. Lily came home. 63 children were freed. That matters. It all matters. And Anape. She smiled through her tears, touching the pocket where she kept the carved hawk. Nipe was a gift, brief, unexpected, and precious. I'm grateful I knew him, even if I couldn't keep him. Do you think you'll ever see him again?" "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe that week was all we were meant to have. Sometimes the most important people in our lives aren't the ones who stay the longest. They're the ones who change us the most." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and violet. Inside, Jacob was helping Moses with his homework, while Benjamin entertained the little ones with a story about brave warriors and clever widows. Ordinary sounds, safe sounds, the sounds of a life rebuilt from ashes. Somewhere to the north, in the vast territory that had almost killed her, a Lakota warrior was watching the same sunset. A girl who'd been lost was found. Justice imperfect and incomplete had been served. The guilty had been punished. The innocent had been protected. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no happily ever after, no resolution that tied everything up with a neat bow. But it was real. It was true. And it was enough. Josephine Hart had survived. Her sons had survived. 63 children had come home, and 2 people from different worlds had found each other in the darkness and held on long enough to see the dawn. In the hard, unforgiving world of 1878 Wyoming, that was more than most people ever got. That evening she sat at her writing desk and composed a reply. The words came slowly at first, then faster, pouring out everything she'd been holding inside for a year. "Dear Anape, your letter arrived this morning and brought me both joy and sorrow. Joy to know you and Lily are well, sorrow that we are so far apart. My boys are thriving. Samuel works for a lawyer now and speaks of justice and law with a passion that would have made his father proud. Jacob teaches the younger ones their letters. Moses has discovered a love of drawing. Benjamin has your talent for wood carving. Perhaps he absorbed it through observation during our journey. Thomas and Daniel are growing like weeds. We live in Denver now in a small house with a garden. It is peaceful here and safe, and sometimes the peace feels strange after everything we endured. You say you think of me often. I want you to know that I think of you every day. When I see the mountains, I remember you teaching me to load the Colt. When I hear thunder, I remember Whirlwind Gap. When I hold the hawk you carved, I remember that love can exist even when it cannot endure. Thank you for fighting beside me. Thank you for protecting my sons. Thank you for showing me that courage comes in many forms, and that honor transcends the boundaries we build between peoples. I hope our paths cross again someday. But if they don't know this, you changed my life in AA. You saved it. Yes, but you also changed it. You showed me what it means to be truly seen by another person. That is a gift I will carry until my last breath. Be well. Be happy. Tell Lily that Mrs. Hart says hello, and that she is glad, so glad that Lily is home where she belongs. Yours always, Josephine. She sealed the letter, addressed it in care of the Indian agent at the reservation, and placed it on the whole table to be mailed in the morning. Then she went inside, kissed each of her sleeping sons good night, and lay down in her own bed. She touched the carved hawk on her nightstand, and she thought of a Lakota warrior under the same stars, and she slept peacefully for the first time in a year. The world was hard. The world was often cruel. But sometimes in the midst of darkness and danger, two souls could find each other and create something beautiful, even if it could only last a moment. That was enough.